You know, when we discuss theology, we use terms like, well, I'm a Calvinist, or I'm an Arminian, or I'm a Baptist, or I'm a Protestant, or I'm Assemblies of God, or I'm Reformed, whatever the terms may be. Well, there's this unfortunate thing that takes place way too often. Someone will undoubtedly come up and say, you know, you guys shouldn't be divided like that. And then they're going to read you a passage of Scripture that they think applies. And it's 1 Corinthians chapter 1, starting in verse 11. And Paul says this in this passage, "My brothers, some from Chloe's house have informed me that there are quarrels among you. What I mean is this. One of you says, I follow Paul. Another, I follow Apollos. Another, I follow Cephas. Still another, I follow Christ." And Paul goes on to make some good arguments. Is Christ divided? And he's calling for unity. And they think what is taking place here in Corinthians is what's taking place when someone uses these terms to define their theological position. But these two things are completely different. When someone says, I'm a Calvinist or I'm an Arminian, what they're saying is these people taught two completely different things. And I believe Calvin was right that Christ taught this, or I believe Arminius was right that Christ taught this. So what we're doing is we're saying there's two different teachings, and they both can't be right. And so, I believe Scripture teaches the way Calvin understood it, or I believe Scripture teaches the way Arminius understood it. But that's not what was taking place here in Corinthians. Because Paul, Apollos, Cephas, and Christ all taught the exact same thing. This had nothing to do with doctrinal differences. In fact, had one of them been teaching a false doctrine, like let's say Apollos was teaching grace and works, Paul would have said, first of all, Apollos has nothing to do with this. Get him out of here. He's a heretic. Let him be anathema. I mean, that's the way he speaks of those who try to add works to salvation in Galatians. But that's not what was taking place here. They all taught the same thing. This was an issue of pride. Some people in the church actually thought they were better than the others because, they learned under or studied Paul, the great spiritual teacher. And others thought they were better because, they studied and read and listened to Apollos, the great orator. And others said, well, I think you guys don't quite have it right because I follow Cephas, and he was with Christ and he has a little deeper insight. And some even said, well, you guys can have those teachers. I'm going to study what Christ said. And maybe even some of them were led to the faith by Christ himself. And so they thought they were better than other people. Now, we must realize that these are completely different things that are taking place. And here's the interesting thing about it. The final category is that some said, I follow Christ. They too can be part of the problem. You see, it's quite often the case that someone who says, someone's arguing for Calvinism, or arguing Arminianism, or the Baptist thought, or Presbyterian thought, or whatever it might be on a certain issue, or dispensationalism and covenantalism. Some will say, well, you guys follow your schools of thought. You guys follow those teachers. Me? I follow Christ. As if somehow they're above the fray and they don't have to discuss these doctrines. That quite often can be more arrogant than what the Calvinist, the Arminian, the Baptist, or whatever it might be, are doing. Now, it is true that there are Calvinists, that there are Arminians, that there are Reformed folks, that there are whatever it might be, who use their position as a form of pride and superiority. More than just thinking, I believe this is what the Bible teaches. And when people do that are wrong. We see plenty of bad examples of that here on YouTube. But this is not typically, at least in the circles I run, what is taking place when someone says, I'm a dispensationalist or I'm a covenantal theologian, follow them. It has to do with theological distinctives. And anybody who wants to read this passage and think that theological distinctions should not be made or articulated has not read the rest of Paul, or even the rest of this letter. This is something we are called to do. Now, it is true, Christ is the head of the church. And it is true that that is ultimately who we follow. But just using labels to help people distinguish our theological understanding of what we thought Christ actually taught is not falling into the sin that the Corinthians were doing here. And just a reminder, those of you who say, well, I'm of Christ, be careful. Not always, but you too could be guilty of what's being said here. Just some things to think about.